Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and welcome to the show. Today I'm going to tell you a story about this guy named Stanley. He's a career criminal. When Stanley was 16 years old, he got caught stealing a bicycle out of a department store in the town that he grew up in, right? That he lived in. And they took him in the back and set him down, and they tried to talk to him and explain to him what had happened and what was going on, because these people in the store, they knew Stanley, and they knew his parents. And his parents were hardworking people. They both had jobs. They were not rich, but they were not able to afford to buy Stanley this bicycle. So he decided that he was going to take it. So when they called his parents came down to the store. They were embarrassed because everybody in the store knew what had happened. And then as they walked through the store, they felt everybody staring at them and made them feel bad. So when they get in the back and they're talking to Stanley, they're yelling at him, screaming at him, and all this. And he's sitting there and he's screaming back and he's yelling. And he said he could never forget how embarrassed he felt by his parents yelling at him the way they were yelling at him. And he said he never understood how much that had an impact on him, right? And I'm going to give you the insight on that later on in this episode. But they were allowed to take him home with them that night, but they were going to press charges, and he was going to have to go in front of a juvenile judge. So when the day came that they had to take him down to the judge, his parents had to miss work. So if they missed work, that means they didn't get paid. So they got him down in front of the juvenile judge, and the juvenile judge knew that this boy had never been in any trouble. Stanley had never been in any trouble whatsoever. And he talked to him, and he asked me, he said, "Why did you steal this bike? Why did you try to steal this bike?" So Stanley, crying, told him that he wanted a bicycle like all of his other friends, all the other kids in the neighborhood that he was in. They were all riding bikes and all this and that. And the judge told him that, maybe if you would have worked for it or got a job and this and that and the third, that you would have been able to get the bicycle or whatever, or your parents would have been able to eventually get it for you, right? But you didn't have the patience. You didn't have the patience to wait on something for you to happen, and then that way you would have been able to get a bike without having to take some property from some other people. So the judge decided that he was going to teach Stanley a lesson by sending him away to a juvenile facility for 6 months. Now you got to keep in mind, Stanley had never been separated from his parents in his life. In his life. And up until that point in his life, he had been doing a good job. Teenagers get in trouble. Teenagers get in trouble. Teenagers do things, right? So Stanley, he's standing there, and he's not fully comprehending what the judge is telling him, because the judge is telling him he has to be taken away. So the two bailiffs, the two officers, they come and they tell him to put his hands behind his back. And they put handcuffs on him in front of his parents in the juvenile courtroom. And they let him take the time to talk to his parents, and his parents hugged him, his mother hugged him and crying, and she did not want to let him go. So after a few minutes, they told her it's time for him to go. They escorted him in the back, and they told her that she would be able to come, both the mother and the father actually, that they would be able to come and see him, and they gave him all the information that they would need, right? So when they took Stanley in the back, he was screaming and crying, wanting to go home. You got to remember, he had never been separated from his parents a day in his life like that. So after he was gone, the parents, they tried to talk to the judge about what had just happened to see if there was anything that they could do so that he wouldn't have to spend 6 months in custody. Besides, they were making their plea to him. They were telling him he's never been in any trouble. He's a good kid. So the judge talked to them in a way that made them feel like they were not good parents. He told them that this is the first time that he's been caught, but it must have been other times that he had been in trouble and doing other things, and they just were not aware of it, and he was going to stop it before it became too bad. So that made the mother feel so bad about the situation, because both of them were working hard, trying to provide a good home for Stanley, and they were doing a good job. But they had to work, and they couldn't watch him every second of the day. What parent can watch their child every second of the day? So when they left that courtroom, they felt like they had just lost their son, plus they had been told that they were not good parents. So all the way home, they rode in silence. And when they finally got home, the husband, he got out of the car and he walked around to the side of the car where his wife was at. He opened the door and let her out, and she just couldn't get up. She couldn't get out of the car. Her legs were not there. So when she got out of the car, she collapsed in his arms, and she was crying. She was like, what is he going to do? How is this going to affect him? And she just kept crying, we got to get him out of there. We got to get him out of there. So he told her that he would do everything that he could, and she told him, you need to do whatever you got to do to get our son out of there. So as time went on, the reality set in about the situation. It was nothing that he could do. He hired a lawyer. The lawyer took that money, went to talk to the judge, and the judge told him that was it. It was 6 months. He was going to do 6 months, and then he would get out. And while he was in there, he could go to school and he can get some structure in his life. This is what the judge is telling the lawyer, and the lawyer is telling the parents. And it's further making the parents feel like they are not good parents. Making them feel like they're not good parents. And now everybody in the community is talking about Stanley, because this is a child that used to be in the community, playing in the streets, running up and down the streets, throwing the football, riding a bicycle, doing all of those types of things. And now he was absent. And the other kids in the neighborhood that had gotten used to Stanley being around, being there, playing with them, and all of these types of things, and being in school, it started to have an effect on them. And they all felt like something was off here. Something was off. So they stopped playing with each other. Some of the parents was like, I don't want my child around this child. I don't want my child around that child, and so on and so forth, right? Because some of these kids Stanley played with, and they felt like if Stanley had been playing with these kids over here, then they must be bad kids too. So it started to scatter. And now the kids that used to play together and enjoy each other's company, now none of them are playing together. Meanwhile, Stanley's at this juvenile facility, and he's making new friends. And these are the types of people that have been in and out of the facility many, many, many times, right? But keep in mind, they started the same way that Stanley did. They've been there, out, all of these types of things, right? And now they seem to be hardened. And that's how the other people at the facility treated them. They were used to him. They knew him by name. They knew how they acted. They knew if somebody got in trouble that this must have been Johnny over here. This must have been Bill, because this is how they do. This is what they do. And they were telling Stanley, be careful. Don't be spending too much time with Johnny. Don't be spending too much time with Bill. But there were no other kids at the facility that he could relate to that were his age. This was a juvenile facility. So Stanley started to learn the coping mechanism that you have to learn in an environment like that. He started to learn to stick together with the other kids that were in this facility. I say kids, K-I-D-S, capital K-I-D-S. These were kids. Don't forget it. And some of the kids were in there for violent charges. They had done some things that, if they were adults, they would be sentenced to a hard time in prison. And they were in there as well. And they had learned to maneuver and cope in this environment in a way that made them stand out to everybody else, because the other kids were afraid of them. When they would sit around and they would talk and share the stories about why they were in there, these other kids would tell them, I'm in here for robbery. I'm in here for assault. One of the kids was in there for murder. All of these different types of things, right? And just hearing that these young kids, even the kids that were telling the stories, their minds were not able to process fully the magnitude of what they were talking about and what they were hearing. But they know that it made them feel afraid of these guys. And these kids, knowing that, they took advantage of that, not because they wanted to be, at the top of the pile, but because they thought this is how you survive this environment. Even at this young age, they were learning that certain types of charges gave you certain leeway in a facility like this. So they started to learn the hierarchy of how incarceration works. Now keep in mind, Stanley is learning all of these things about himself, what he's really afraid of. He's learning to fight. Never been in a fight before, not one fight a day in his life, but he's starting to get in fights every other day with people, because he's trying to learn and figure out where his place is in this. If he didn't fight, he could lose his food. If he didn't fight, they would take his tennis shoes. Now, these kids that were doing these things, they thought that this is how you're supposed to act in this environment of incarceration. And Stanley was learning that if you don't want to be taken advantage of in this environment, that you have to fight back. So you got both sides learning the wrong lessons. And the people that were in charge not teaching them the right lessons. They're telling them to walk in straight lines. They're making them go to school. But they're not asking them. They're not asking them, why do you think like this? Where did this come from? They're not providing them the therapy that they would need. So they're learning how to live in an incarcerated environment. And some of the staff that work there, some of the officers that work there, they're talking to them in a way to where you better get ready, because when you go to the adult facility, this is what they're going to do to you, right? So these kids are afraid, so they're learning to get ready for a worse situation, not understanding that they don't have to be in this situation. But the people that worked at this facility, it's not like they didn't care. It was like this is what they knew to do. So everybody in this incarcerated environment was teaching the wrong lessons. The people that were living in this incarcerated environment, they were learning the wrong lessons. So after about 4 or 5 months, Stanley had become this hardened type of individual. And yes, his parents had been visiting him and all this, and they started to see the change that was taking place within him. He didn't talk as much. He didn't share as much. He was more closed off to them. His mother could see the pain in his eyes, but he would not allow himself to go there. And she would hug him and she would tell him it's okay. But he knew. He had learned that it wasn't okay. Because he knew that when his parents leave, he had to go back behind that door. And once he goes back behind that door, the reality of his world was dominant over what his parents said, because he had learned that his parents couldn't protect him. He had learned that his parents couldn't save him from this environment. He had to do it himself. It's a lot to carry when you're that young age. And that goes for all the other people that were in that environment. Well, then most people say, well, Joe, what do you think should be done with it? What do you think we should do? Well, I'll get to that later in the show. So 6 months came up. It was time for Stanley to go in front of the juvenile judge, the same juvenile judge that had sentenced him to the 6 months. And before he left the facility, a lot of the kids in the facility that had been in front of this juvenile judge and other juvenile judges before, they told Stanley, said, look here, this is what you need to go in front of him and say. Go in front of him and tell him you learned your lesson, you're not going to do it anymore, this, that, and the third, right? When the truth was, what he had learned was to be hateful towards the system, disrespectful towards authority. But he learned these lessons to survive. Because if he didn't do these things in the incarcerated environment that he was in, he would be preyed upon by the other individuals in that incarcerated environment that had learned that this is how they need to conduct themselves, directly or indirectly, from the staff or the other people that had been in and out of the facility for several different occasions and several different years. You know what I'm saying? These other young people had learned that this is how you have to conduct yourself. Nobody bothered to step in and say, you don't have to act this way. You don't have to fight each other. But what you got to understand is when you take kids, or adults for that matter, out of an environment that they're used to being in, regardless of the circumstances that pull them out of that environment, you're throwing them in an environment that is already set. That is already set. And that environment has already been set by the things you watch on TV, the things you hear about when people that have been in those environments get out and come home and talk about. Because the people, let me tell you something about the people that come out of these places and go home, whether it be juveniles or adults, right? They're scared. Those first few times. When you see somebody that's been in and out, they're not scared anymore. They don't even realize that they're numb. But those first few times, the individuals that are getting out, they're scared. And they don't want you to know. Listen to what I'm trying to tell you, parents and friends of the adults that are getting out of these places. They don't want you to know that they are or were afraid in there. So they're going to tell you all of these things about how they was holding it down and doing all of these super fantastic things in there, getting money, whooping people, all this and that, disrespecting the police. They're going to tell you all of these things. But what they won't tell you is this. The things that they did, which all the stuff that they probably told you is true, but they didn't do it for those reasons. They did it to survive the environment, to cope. because they thought that's what they had to do so that they wouldn't be preyed upon by the other individuals that would be watching. And this goes for juveniles and adults. This environment of incarceration, this toxic environment of incarceration has been given to us in a way to where it's not helpful for us, it's not helpful for the system, and it's not helpful most definitely for society and the community that the individuals that are getting out of here are going to be going back into. But nobody seems to know what to do about that other than to say, lock them up and throw away the key. Now, Stanley, he said all of the things that he needed to say in front of the judge in order for the judge to say, okay, I'm going to release you to the custody of your family. Listen to what I just said, y'all. The judge says, I'm going to release you to the custody of your family. And when he released Stanley to the custody of his family, I guess the system and the judge and the people in the program and the people in the system, they automatically must believe that now Stanley's mind is going to switch back to being a child. But no. Something has happened to Stanley. I'll call it traumatization, but you can call it whatever you want to call it. But Stanley's different. He don't feel comfortable in his bedroom anymore. He don't feel comfortable in the environment that he grew up in. He don't feel comfortable playing in the streets with the kids anymore. He don't feel comfortable throwing the football. He don't feel comfortable being around these kids that have known him his whole life. He seems to feel and think and need those individuals that he was around for 6 months. 16 years of familiarity was gone. It was the last 6 months that were dominating his thoughts. The people that he had gotten to know in those last 6 months, those people that he had gotten to know when he was afraid, seemed to be more important to him than the people that he had known for 16 years, even his parents. He loved his parents and he hugged his parents and he cried, but it was something that was keeping him. It was something had happened, something that he couldn't even explain and the parents couldn't even understand. Something had become a hindrance. Something had gotten between him and the love that he needed to pour out and receive from his parents. It was fear. It was the fear of, if I let my guard down again and I love my parents the way I want to love my parents and I bond to my friends the way I want to bond to my friends, that fear of what happens if they take me away again? What happens if they take me away again? So he didn't want to let that guard down. From that point on, he stayed on guard about what could happen, not what was happening. And he stayed terrified. And when he went back to school, the teachers could tell the difference in Stanley. They knew that he had changed. They knew that this wasn't the kid, K-I-D-S, capital K-I-D-S, right? Well, capital K-I-D, excuse me. This wasn't the kid that they knew before. And it alarmed them. So they went into protective mode. And when they went into protective mode, they were like, we might need to put Stanley in an alternative school. Separate him from the kids that haven't been in a situation like his. And when they did that, they put Stanley with other kids that had been in the same environment that he had just come from. And in some strange way, he felt more comfortable around them. They had a shared experience. It's almost like soldiers that go off to war and this group traumatization that takes place. It got everybody bonding to one another. His parents couldn't bond to him the way the individuals that he spent 6 months with. His friends that he used to play in the streets couldn't bond to him in the way that the people that he spent 6 months with. But these kids in this alternative school, they could. They had a shared experience. It's like soldiers that have experienced war. No matter what generation it was, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Gulf War, it didn't matter. Iraq, Syria, it didn't matter. They all understood what it meant to be in that environment. So they had this common bond. And that's the same thing that Stanley was experiencing when he got put in this alternative school. Yeah, he continued to love his parents, but it wasn't the same. He felt all alone at 16 years old. Yeah, they gave him a roof over his head and food and clothes, and they loved him as much as they knew how to love on him. But he kept them at bay because he had gotten to the point in his mind after 6 months, 16 years of taking care of him, 6 months of being away from them, he felt as though, keep in mind, he has a 16-year-old kid's mind. He couldn't process that right. He felt as though he couldn't depend on him. But he didn't know how to verbalize that. When they took him in the back in their courtroom and they took him off to that facility, he couldn't cope. But see, Stanley didn't even understand what his parents had been through. His parents had been through it because they felt as though they had failed him, they had disappointed him, they had let him down. And now that he was home and he was acting this way, it confirmed that to him, to them. It confirmed to them that that judge might have been right. What did we miss? So now they're going overboard trying to make sure that they make up for whatever it was they missed because they want their son back. So they're dominating this time. They're always around. They're crowding him. They're taking him to events. They're trying to do all the things that they know to do. Checking off all the boxes, sporting events, family events, spending time with him, talking to him, sharing what happened at school. All of these types of things because that's all they know to do. But it's not breaking through. And it's making the parents feel some kind of way. It's making them feel resentment towards their son. It's making them feel like something's wrong with you. Don't you see what we're trying to do? Don't you see that we love you? Don't you see all the things, the effort that we're making? You don't appreciate anything. And it was pushing Stanley further and further away. Further and further away. So now Stanley graduates from that class into the next class, and then he from the next class to the next class, and he finally graduates high school. Not at the top of the class, not even at the middle. He just barely made it, but he made it. But now he's in the thick of it. He believes that the individuals that he's been spending time with in this alternative classes and that other individuals that had gotten out from other juvenile facilities, these are his friends now. These are the people that he has this shared traumatization with. So he bonds with them, not out of love, out of fear. I know people tell you that love conquers all, right? But it has to break through in order to work. And the fear that Stanley felt had become so powerful, so large for him, that he was afraid to let it in. He was afraid to let it in. So when Stanley got 21, he turned 21 years old. He got his first real taste of prison. And when he got his first real taste of prison, he started to realize some things. And you're going to have to come back and check out this next episode so you can understand what this is going to be about, what this whole story is going to end up teaching you. Because I learned so much when I was going through this with the guy that was telling me how he had come to be this career criminal. So I want you to stick around, okay? Come back to this next episode because this is important. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I'll say peace, y'all.
I'm getting so tired.